Hey, everybody. I am excited this week to speak on listening. I think, as a communication standpoint, this is the most important aspect of communication. So far, what we've looked at is we've looked at our perceptions of ourselves, our perception of others. We've looked at nonverbal, verbal communication and culture, but listening is a big piece. When it comes to communication, especially in today's age, far too much communication is taking place without much listening. And the listening that's taking place isn't really that effective. Far too many people are expressing their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own opinions, which is great. And there's a time and place for that, but few are actually listening to others. And so, as communicators, if we could become and develop our listening skills and become more effective listeners, you'll find that it's almost a superpower in building relationships with other people, in connecting with other people, and for effectively communicating. So, after this lecture, we will all be better listeners. To better understand how listening takes place, we have to understand the 5 stages that listening involves. The first stage is going to be receiving. This is where you're actually taking in the information that somebody is saying. Now, this is where it's important in this step to fully listen. This means we want to focus our attention on what they're saying. We want to limit the amount of distractions that are taking place and to actually focus our whole attention on what they're saying. So you've received what they are saying, then you seek to find understanding. Now, the order of this is important because far too often we put understanding before receiving, meaning that we are already trying to come up with what they're saying or come up with the response, or we're trying to think, or we're trying to finish their sentence, all before actually listening to what they are saying. So when you're engaging with communication and when you are engaging with somebody, it's important to fully hear them out before trying to understand it. And this might seem a little bit unnatural at times because for me, I know one thing that I do is when somebody's talking to me, I am usually trying to complete their sentence. So it takes a lot of cognitive effort to fight that urge and to actively listen to what somebody is saying. Because here's the thing, even though we think we know what they're going to say, and in some cases you might be right, chances are there's some sort of either nuance or there's some sort of piece of information that is not, that you didn't know. And there's more that you can learn. Engaging with anybody, and I mean anybody, is something that we could learn from someone. We could learn something from anybody. And so but it takes us actively listening to them to be able to do that. It doesn't matter the other person's perspectives or their background or anything along those lines. If you listen intently to somebody, there's something you can learn. At the very least, you at least understand more of their perspective. So now that you've received the information, and then you've taken that in and you've understood what they are saying, if you haven't reached a point of understanding, this is the point where you might want to interject and say, okay, hey, can you help clarify something? I didn't quite understand what you're saying here. So what did you mean by that? Seek that understanding. Once you have that understanding, then we want to apply that into our memory. Now, researchers debate back and forth how we as people remember things, but there are some effective tools that you could use to better your memory. Some of these things are just, if you are focusing on what's important, you'll have a higher chance of remembering those key aspects. Try to find the theme of what people are saying. Just like in writing, there's a common theme that goes through. There's a thesis of what somebody is trying to say. The same thing pertains to when we're conversing. There are some main points, and if you focus on those things, you'll find that you have a better chance of remembering what's important. In today's day and age, we are just bombarded with information. We are bombarded with just a lot of stimulus. And so it takes some skill to be able to filter through all of that noise and focus on the aspect that's most important. Once you have that focus, what you want to do is relate it to something that you already know. You want to relate it in the sense that you attach it. Our memories work in a particular way that if you attach a new memory to one that you've already had, you're more likely to remember that, because our synapses then all of a sudden connect. You take this disconnected concept, this new idea, and then you attach it to something that you already have. It's going to be sticky. It's going to attach to it. It's a funny thing of saying that, but imagine if it kind of like a spider web, it branches out and it's all that. But then if you take this new memory and attach it to it, then you're adding to that, and it kind of sticks to it. So if you could attach it to an existing memory that you already have, and if you need to categorize it in a way that makes sense with your brain, our brains are kind of like a computer system. Similar ways that you have folders on your desktop, our brains kind of work the same way. So if you need to, you could break it down into different components to be able to easily remember that. And then finally, you want to repeat it, meaning that you want to, in some way, shape, or form, re-say what your memory. So sometimes that means writing it down. Sometimes that means repeating it verbally. For instance, one way to help remember names is that if you repeat it back to them. So if somebody says, "Hey, welcome. Hey, my name is Bob," then you say, "Hey, it's nice to meet you, Bob." If it's a name that maybe you don't know how to pronounce, you can ask them to spell it. These are different ways that by repeating it, it then more so deeply ingrains into your memory. Advertisers will go by a rule of thumb that a person has to see an ad 7 times before it sticks. We need that repetition. And so now that you've received what they've said, you've understood what it is, you've attached it to your memory, the next thing then is to evaluate it. This is where you put your own thoughts, opinions, emotions into this. Far too often we put evaluating before some of these other earlier steps, and what happens is then we're all of a sudden interrupting people. We're interjecting our thoughts, or we're only talking about ourselves. And so these are things that you want to kind of avoid if you're trying to actively listen. Think about it. Think about the last time you had a conversation with someone who just solely spoke about themselves. Chances are we all know somebody who just, when you speak to them, it's hard for them to talk about anybody other than themselves. And unfortunately, those kind of conversations are hard to engage into. They're not the funnest thing to do, because yes, at times it is important that people talk about themselves. But if that's all there is, then chances are that they're not listening to other people. They're not viewing other people, and it's a one-sided relationship. So it's important that you reserve your judgment, reserve any evaluating that you have until later. First, take in what they are saying, understand it, apply it to your memory. Then all of a sudden, the next step is to then interject with your own thoughts, your own feelings. And once you have that, then you'll actually formulate a response. You'll then communicate that to the other person. And what you'll find is this is actually a cycle. So you've gone through the receiving, then into understanding, then you've now applied it to your memory, you've thought about it, you've expressed your own thoughts, opinions, feelings, and then you've expressed that to the other person, then you go back to receiving, because then all of a sudden they're going to then say something back to you. And it's that back and forth, kind of like how we spoke earlier about that. So that's kind of the understanding of how the model works, of how listening takes place. But it's important to understand some of the common barriers that we fall into when listening. And the main ones are going to be physical and mental barriers. These are things that get in the way of us being able to actually give our full, undivided attention to someone. So, for instance, this could be somebody having a hearing impairment. This would be a physical example of someone having a barrier to listening. Your communication is going to be different if one or both of you have a hearing impairment than if you didn't. And so it's important to understand these things so that you can work to alleviate some of those barriers. Mental barriers would be something like if you're distracted, if you're highly anxious, if you are, maybe super busy and you've got a lot on your mind, well, it's hard to take that off if you're communicating with someone. When I come home from work, I have to take a second to clear my mind before I come into the house, because if I don't, then my mind is boggled down with all the stuff from the day. Oh, I have this due. I have that. Oh, I need to make sure I get this done. And then when I engage with my family, with my wife and my kids, it's I'm not going to be as mentally available if I don't do that. And so to effectively listen to them and see how their day is going, to engage in that conversation, it's important that you kind of try to alleviate some of those barriers. Biases and prejudices are another form of that. All of us have some sort of biases towards things. And so it's important for us to understand what those biases are to the best of our ability, so that we can make sure that they aren't getting in the way of us listening. If maybe the appearance of someone or the type of person they are or the way they communicate is something that we have a bias towards, or if we have any prejudices towards, we need to make sure that those are alleviated, be able to effectively listen. And then simply sometimes we're just not focused on what's taking place. We're distracted. There's things going on. A big barrier in today's conversations there's a lack of appropriate focus. For instance, if we're scrolling on social media, we're bombarded with hundreds and hundreds of posts. It's hard to focus on it's hard to listen to them all. You can't listen to them. So you have to kind of figure out what you're focusing on and what you're not. And as mentioned earlier, it's important to kind of reserve your judgment for later. Oftentimes we are interjecting our judgments prior to actually listening. And this can get in the way of our listening. If before even somebody talks, we're judging the situation, we're judging them, then it's hard for us to actually listen to what they have to say. If we come into it with an open mind and an open form of communication, you'll find that the conversation is going to go much more effectively. Now, there's 4 main styles of listening. First one's going to be empathetic. And empathetic listening is just you're engaging with someone from their perspective. When they're talking, you're trying to take an empathetic viewpoint, which means that you're trying to see the perspective from their shoes. Now, this does not necessarily mean that you agree with them, but it does mean that you're trying to understand their perspective. This would be something like if a friend comes to you with a problem, maybe they're going through a breakup and they're, coming to you for support. Well, an empathetic approach might be an appropriate approach for that. Just to listen to them, be there with them, hear them out. Polite listening is another form. And this is kind of culturally based. This is based off of how some cultures expect that you show certain forms of politeness. Other cultures want you to be more direct, more honest with your feedback. Polite listening is someone who's highly engaged in what they're saying, so they're maybe giving a lot of feedback in the sense of nonverbals. Maybe you might be agreeing, shaking your head. You may be going, oh yeah, I hear you. Oh yeah, oh wow. Like you're giving a lot of those things and you're giving them the ground to talk. There's no interrupting, nothing along those lines. The next line is critical. So this is where you try to find the logic behind what's going on. You're picking apart the conversation, the communication, and you're trying to deeply understand it and apply it to your own knowledge that you have, and then come up with a new understanding. This would be from the form of like right now. I'm giving a lecture right now. If you're critically listening, then you're taking in this information, you're trying to understand it, you're trying to apply it to that memory, and then you want to figure out ways to apply it to your real life. And you may even interject with your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own opinions into that. And then finally, active listening. And this is a highly effective form of communication. Active listening is you engaging in a reciprocal process, meaning that when they are talking, you allow them the floor to fully conversate what they're going to say. Afterwards, you might give something like a summary, or you might rephrase what they said to let them know that you heard what they said. So, for instance, if they're talking about the breakup, well, you might, say, "Oh, wow, you know, so what you're saying is that the relationship ended for this reason, and it's left you feeling really sad and lonely right now. Is that what I'm getting from this?" This does two things. On one hand, it lets the speaker know that you're listening, because you've now rephrased what they're saying. Is showing that, okay, you have picked up on what I'm saying. You are actively listening to what I have to say. But you also give them the floor to correct something. If you maybe perceive something wrong, if maybe you didn't get all the information, or maybe they didn't effectively communicate something, well, that allows some ground to be able to clear that up. And so by you repeating back to them what they said, and by you explaining maybe how you're perceiving their emotions, that gives them a chance to either say, yes, that's exactly how I feel, or give them a chance to say, well, that's not actually what's going on. So as you seek to understand your own listening styles, you might want to think about, okay, what style of listening do you typically use in conversations? Do you lean one way more than another? Are there areas where maybe you should try other types of styles and try to incorporate those? Ask yourself, how might you go about listening better? What are things that you could do to be a better listener? And then you want to ask yourself, do others listen to you? When you talk, do you feel heard? And if you do, who makes you feel that way? And what are they doing that makes you feel heard? And for somebody who makes you feel not heard, what are they doing? And so here now we can take some practical steps towards becoming a better listener. You understand the cycles, the stages of listening. We know the different styles of listening. And so now we need to understand, how is it that we can become a better listener? Well, the first approach you could do is position yourself in an other-centered approach, meaning that you seek to understand the other person's perspective first. Put them first over yourselves and your own thoughts and your own opinions. This allows that person to be able to effectively communicate on their end. Then you can take that in and effectively communicate back. Then you want to seek understanding and reserve judgment for later, meaning that you want to fully understand what they're saying. Don't jump to conclusions. What we should not be doing is jumping to conclusions or trying to make any assumptions towards what anyone's saying. If you feel like somebody is communicating something and they haven't clearly stated it, ask them, clear it up, give them a chance to maybe clear the air a little bit. If you maybe feel like somebody's upset with something, ask them, is this something that's upsetting you? You appear to be getting a little bit upset. Am I reading that right? Give them the ground to maybe correct that, or say, yes, I am getting upset. And then after they've fully communicated their thoughts, their opinions, their beliefs, whatever it is, you've understood what their perspective, then you can interject with your own judgment. Then you can make the ideas your own assumptions. Sorry, not assumptions, but your own ideas, and then you can express that respectfully to the other person. If you go through these steps, you'll find that we will all be far better listeners, and it'll be something highly effective in our communication. So now I'm going to ask you again, are you listening? Engage over the next 24 hours. I challenge you to think about how much are you listening? When you're engaging in conversations, take note how often maybe you're getting distracted, or how often maybe you're thinking about other things. Think about these things. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.